Good day. Today is Friday, 17th October 2025. And before I get to the substance of this program, let me first of all remind you once again to tick the like button if once you've watched this video or whatever part of the video you want to watch, you've liked what you've seen and heard, and decide that you should express your appreciation of it or want to express your appreciation of it by ticking the like button. Thank you, and let me now proceed with the substance of this program. And of course, it's not difficult to work out in advance what I'm going to mostly discuss, which is a conversation that took place yesterday between President Putin of Russia and President Donald Trump of the United States, and the agreement of these two presidents to have a summit meeting in Budapest in perhaps 2 weeks' time. And this has completely upended the entire diplomacy of the last 2 weeks, and it perhaps explains some of the really rather strange and tense moves and statements and events which we have been seeing coming out of Moscow over the last week or so, 2 weeks or so, which I have been discussing on this channel and which we have been talking about, Alex Christoforou and myself, on the Duran. Now, before discussing, however, both the conversation and the lead up to the conversation and the forthcoming summit, it's perhaps worth pointing out that the expectation as of yesterday was that today would be Vladimir Zelensky's day. He was arriving in the United States. In fact, he has already been in the United States, as I understand it, for several hours. He came with a very strong delegation. A lot of his assistants and officials accompanied him. He's had apparently a meeting with Raytheon, the United States defense contractor, which makes both the Patriot missiles and the Tomahawk missiles that he wants to obtain. And all of the indications were that he was expecting, once he met Donald Trump, that there would be an announcement that the United States would supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And this was absolutely, I'm no doubt at all, this is what Zelensky himself was expecting and anticipating, and he was no doubt looking forward to a very friendly and successful meeting with Donald Trump. As we all know, far from all of his meetings with Donald Trump have been successful or friendly. But anyway, Zelensky must have thought that the events of today would be in his favor. And, well, he's arrived, and as Axios pointed out, as soon as he arrived, he discovered that Trump, the person he was probably looking forward to meeting, had just had a telephone call with Vladimir Putin. And, well, shortly after, Trump made comments which now strongly suggest that Trump does not intend to supply Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, and perhaps never did. Now, one can never be certain about this, certainly not with a personality as complicated as Donald Trump. But briefly, what Trump said in response to questions from the media was, yes, Tomahawks are incredibly powerful, enormously deadly, even poisonous weapons. Strange choice of words, by the way. But anyway, vicious, poisonous, immensely powerful, extraordinarily successful weapons, and that the United States does actually have a significant number of them, but the United States cannot afford to deplete its stockpile of these weapons because the United States needs them itself. Now, a lot of people who have been skeptical about this idea of supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine have been saying this for some time, and I can't help but think that there is certainly a powerful group within the Pentagon, who have already become very concerned by the depletion of America's stockpiles of other weapons, who have been making precisely this point to Donald Trump over the last couple of weeks, even as this topic of supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine has gained added and ever greater force. And of course, as the Financial Times reported in an article it recently did, one US defense expert thought that the greatest number of Tomahawk missiles that the United States would be able to provide to Ukraine would be between 20 and 50, because the United States could not afford a further depletion of its stockpiles. Well, that all may be true. It's not what Donald Trump has been suggesting or insinuating up to now. I strongly suspect that he's turned against the idea of supplying Tomahawk missiles, at least for the moment, because of things that Vladimir Putin said to him over the course of the call. And of course, he doesn't want to say that he's changed his mind about supplying the Tomahawk missiles because of what Putin told him. So he is now falling back on that argument that others, no doubt, from the Pentagon have been making to him, and is saying, well, maybe supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine isn't such a great idea after all, because actually, though we got a fairly large number of them, we can't afford to deplete our stockpile. Anyway, regardless of this, it must seem to Zelensky extremely unlikely now that he's going to get an announcement from Donald Trump to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine today. It's not something that can be completely ruled out, but it would be a very strange thing for Donald Trump to do a few weeks, 2 weeks perhaps, before he's due to meet Vladimir Putin in Budapest, especially given that, in light of some of the things that Putin, we know, said to Trump about Tomahawk missiles, Trump must have serious doubts about whether Putin would be prepared to go along with the meeting in Budapest at all if an announcement were made today to supply the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Now, I say that, of course, by the time you're watching this program, it's likely that a decision or an announcement might have been made. As I said, Trump is an unpredictable personality. It may be that he's going to throw caution to the winds and decide, under the spell of Zelensky's remarkable personality, that he's going to supply the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. After all, nothing can ever be excluded with this president. We'll give an example a little later of this program of why this is a president who is so difficult to read. But anyway, as things stand, that is looking much less likely than had appeared to be the case yesterday. And Vladimir Zelensky is going to feel, if this is correct, and if he doesn't get the commitment to supply the Tomahawks today, he is going to get a bitter feeling, a bitter sense of déjà vu, because he has been in exactly this same situation once before. That was, well, twice before. The first, arguably, was in May, when it seemed as if Donald Trump, together with the other European leaders, was preparing to impose massive sanctions on Russia and tariffs on Russia's trading partners, China and India. And this was all coordinated with the European leaders, and the European leaders went to Kiev and met with Zelensky there. And on the Friday, they delivered an ultimatum to Putin to agree a ceasefire by Monday, the following Monday. This is on the weekend, by the way, of the Victory Day parade celebrations in Moscow. And then they were completely taken off balance when Putin came along and said, well, he's not going to announce a ceasefire. That wasn't what he was proposing to do. But instead, he was going to send a delegation of negotiators to Istanbul, and that these negotiators would wait and see if the Ukrainians turned up. And then a few hours later, instead of enforcing the ultimatum that the European leaders had all agreed, Trump suddenly said this is an extraordinary, wonderful thing, that the negotiators are indeed heading to Istanbul, and that the Ukrainians must agree to send negotiators to Istanbul also. And Zelensky, as I remember, was very upset and very angry. He didn't want to send the negotiators initially. Eventually, after all sorts of pressure, principally from President Erdogan of Turkey, he did. But anyway, his expectations then of massive, overwhelming sanctions against Russia were dashed at the last moment. And then we went through the whole play again in July and August, because again in July, Donald Trump, under pressure from the hardliners in the Senate, Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal, announced that unless the Russians came to a deal, an agreement with the Ukrainians to end the fighting by the beginning of August, or, as was subsequently confirmed, the 8th of August, then Trump would announce massive sanctions against Russia and tariffs against India and China, 100% tariffs against China and India, equivalent tariffs against Russia, these enormous sanctions and tariffs. And this again looked like an ultimatum. And again, Zelensky was clearly happy and made his happiness known, and was looking forward with enormous expectations, no doubt, to the announcement of these enormous tariffs and sanctions on the 8th of August. Except again, it didn't happen, because in the run-up to that deadline, Donald Trump sent Steve Witkoff to Moscow. Witkoff had a long, extended, protracted meeting with Putin. An agreement for a summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska was agreed. A meeting in Alaska took place. Donald Trump agreed with Putin that movement towards a ceasefire was not necessary, and that there should instead be a full negotiated settlement of the conflict, as the Russians had always argued for. And Trump went further afterwards and said that in light of this meeting that he'd had with Putin and the progress that seemed to be taking place, there was no need to impose the massive sanctions and tariffs on Russia and its trading partners after all. And now Zelensky must feel that for the third time, the same thing is happening. Trump, on the brink, perhaps, of announcing delivery of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, has a telephone conversation with Putin. They've agreed to meet in 2 weeks' time in Budapest, and it doesn't seem as if the delivery of the Tomahawk missiles is going to be announced today, after all. I suspect this is what Zelensky is feeling at this precise moment in time. It is going to make him extremely angry. It is not impossible, by the way, if he meets Trump, that we could have another outburst from Zelensky, rather like the one that took place back in February in the Oval Office, the one which led to so much comment at the time. An outburst, by the way, which originated with Zelensky, the narrative that Zelensky was ambushed by J.D. Vance and Donald Trump at that meeting is wrong. It's not impossible that an angry and frustrated Zelensky could show his anger again over the course of this meeting. He too is a volatile personality, to put it mildly, though I suspect that all sorts of people will be working on him over the next couple of hours and over the last few hours to make sure that he keeps his temper. So anyway, let's move beyond Zelensky now. Important individual though he is in this complex story, and let's consider this conversation that took place, and let's first of all discuss the lead up to it. Now, over the course of the last week, as I said at the start of the program, there's been lots of contradictory signals coming out of Moscow. I say contradictory, they've not been entirely contradictory, but to me, they have given clear indications of increasing tension and disagreement at the highest levels of the Russian government. So last week, we had a statement by the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, to the Russian Parliament, to the Duma, in which Ryabkov said that the momentum created by the Alaska summit had failed, that Alaska looked like it had failed, the momentum was exhausted, the enemies of peace, the Europeans and the Ukrainians and their allies in the United States, had blocked all further progress after Alaska. And it looked as if Ryabkov was basically saying that the progress in Alaska had led nowhere, and that the situation was therefore one where the only way forward was through further war. And I think it was on the same day, or perhaps the day before, Vladimir Putin himself had a meeting with his top generals in St. Petersburg. It took place on the day of his birthday, and of course he was born in St. Petersburg. But firstly, he took them to the Peter and Paul fortress, to the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in the fortress. This is the main fortress in St. Petersburg, built by Peter the Great. He showed them the tombs, he showed the generals the tombs of Peter the Great and of Catherine the Great, the two 18th century rulers of Russia who defeated the Swedes, Western power, NATO power today, in what is today Ukraine, and the rulers who also, in the case of Catherine, conquered the territory on the Black Sea, Crimea, Zaporozhye, Kherson region, Odessa, Nikolaev, all of those places, and made them part of the region called Novorossiya, New Russia, which that subsequently became a part of Russia. And then he had a further meeting with the generals later that day, in which he listened to their plans, gave clear indications that he approved their plans, made no mention or reference to diplomacy at all, and appeared to be green-lighting plans that were clearly circulating in Russia and seem to have their origins with the General Staff for a cross-river operation, the river being the Dnieper, ultimately with the ultimate objective of capturing Odessa and Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast. So everything, all the indications last week was that the entire process of negotiation between the Trump administration and the Russians had come to a stop, and it looked as if the Russians had basically given up on it. And then over the next couple of days, something very extraordinary, very difficult to understand began to happen, because Putin himself and some of his top officials, or at least some of the people who were closest to him, people like Dmitry Peskov, his spokesman, and Ushakov, his foreign policy aide, started to push back on some of this. They said, contradicting Ryabkov, that the Alaska process was not exhausted, that there was still possible routes forward. Putin himself said that Alaska still provided a framework, that there were still hopes that something might be achieved. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, eventually, after a lot of comments by other Russian officials, people like Ambassador Miroshnik and officials within the intelligence community, the Russian intelligence community, who also seemed to be much more skeptical about the prospects of moving forward with the diplomacy in Alaska. Anyway, after all of that, after all of this toing and froing, and, well, I was going to say implicit criticism of Putin, Lavrov gave a massive, and I must say, rather defensive interview to the Russian newspaper Kommersant, in which he suggested that there was still some life in the Alaska process, but that it was basically hanging by a thread. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, Lavrov was challenged throughout that interview time and time again by the journalist that he was speaking to. And the particular issue that was causing all of this tension and anger in Moscow was, of course, the reports that were coming from the United States and from Ukraine that the United States was on the brink of sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And perhaps what infuriated the Russians even more was an article in the Financial Times which brazenly admitted that if the Tomahawk missiles were indeed deployed in Ukraine, even if in only very limited numbers, it would be American personnel who would operate them and who would conduct the deep strikes into Russia. And various Russian officials, including, of course, Putin, all made simultaneously the same point, that the missiles themselves, the Tomahawks, were not seen in Russia as an overwhelming military threat, but as a political act. The United States conducting missile strikes into Russia in this open and brazen way would be something so unprecedented, so extraordinary. It would constitute such a flagrant act of war, which is what it would be, that any possibility of further dialogue with the Americans, of rapprochement with the Americans, of negotiations about Ukraine with the Americans would be buried once and for all. Anyway, this was the talk and the worry and the comments that were going on in Moscow. And there was criticism of Putin and indeed by Kommersant implicitly of Lavrov, that they were still talking about potential dialogue with the United States, in spite of the fact that all of this talk of the US deploying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine was still taking place. And there were two particular moments which for me to stand out. One was over the course of a press conference that Putin gave in Dushanbe, the capital of the Central Asian state of Tajikistan, in which a Russian journalist basically managed to interrupt Putin's flow of words and asked Putin to comment about the Tomahawks, and Putin, who was clearly unhappy, responded that the way that Russia would respond to the Tomahawks would be by beefing up its air defenses, which was a response which I can say straight away did not go down well with Russians. It appeared to be much too passive. And then the other moment was Lavrov's interview with Kommersant, in which Lavrov said that the Russians had made all kinds of proposals to the Americans at the Anchorage meeting, proposals about how to take the whole process, both of improving relations between Russia and the United States, forward, and about how to develop the process of settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, and that the Russians had received no response from the Americans. And Kommersant, the journalist from Kommersant, interjected that there had indeed been a response. The Americans were deciding to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And you could see again, if you read the transcript of the interview, Lavrov's embarrassment. He retreats into a long and involved answer, but he clearly doesn't welcome the question. Anyway, so one could see all of this tension, and I think we now have an explanation, and that is that at some point over the course of the last week, somehow or other, someone or other began the process of arranging this call between Putin and Trump, and it is likely that Putin perhaps restrained himself in some of the things that he said, and other Kremlin officials like Peskov and Ushakov did the same, because they didn't want to say things that might jeopardize the prospect of Putin and Trump having this call. Now, parts of the Russian media have suggested that the call was initiated by the Russians, and it's been claimed that Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, has done this. Well, that may be so, but the text of the readout that Ushakov has provided, which has been published on the Kremlin website, does not say that Ushakov admitted that it was the Russians who initiated the call. And neither does the Kremlin website, by the way. It may be that Ushakov admitted this in answers to journalists' questions. That is not impossible. And it may also be the case that other Russian officials have confirmed the matter to the media, the Russian media as well. I don't know. But anyway, the point is that some discussions undoubtedly were underway over the course of the last week to try to get a call between Putin and Trump set up. And it is not impossible that it was the Russians, and that the Russians wanted to speak to Trump directly because the Russians were worried that Trump himself did not understand the degree to which supply of the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, or rather deployment of the Tomahawk missiles in Ukraine, would be for the Russians a make or break issue. I've said in previous programs that I got the impression that Trump himself was barely aware of the debate that was taking place in Moscow around this issue, that I don't think the Americans themselves actually, or indeed the Western powers altogether, really listen very much to what the Russians say on any question. And I think that in particular, and in this particular case, the Russians were obviously noticing this and felt that given what an important make or break issue this could be, it was essential that the point get through, because otherwise Trump might make a major mistake which would catapult US-Russia relations not just back to where they were under Joe Biden, but arguably in a much worse place even than that. So it is possible, in fact it's likely, that the Russians were indeed trying to reach out to the Americans to get this call organized. However, there is one fact which, even if it doesn't quite argue against, does suggest that this is a more complex story than just the Russians seeking a call with Trump. Because over the course of Lavrov's conversation with Kommersant, the reporter from Kommersant actually asked Lavrov, are you considering contacting the Americans to explain the importance of the issue, the Tomahawk issue, to them? And Lavrov actually replied no. He said, this is not really what we need to do. The Americans are intelligent people. They can work it all out for themselves. This isn't something that Russia has any intention of doing. I mean, that was certainly the impression that I got from reading Lavrov's comments to Kommersant. And that suggests that when Lavrov was talking to Kommersant, he did not know of any plan by Putin, maybe, or other Russian officials to reach out to the Americans at that time, and that he did not expect that such a reach out would take place. So it could be that in the hours after Lavrov's interview with Kommersant, the mood in Moscow shifted, and they decided that maybe it would be a good idea to try to contact the Americans and to set up a call with Trump. But I think this is actually a more complex story. I suspect, in fact, I seem to remember that Trump himself was floating the idea of having a conversation with Putin some weeks ago. Trump is always keen to speak to other leaders, just saying, and I can well imagine that he wanted to speak with Putin, and it's not impossible that he's been trying to speak to Putin for some time. But I think there's also a third party involved, and I suspect that that third party has been instrumental in setting up the call, and that is none other than the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. Now, Orban has been a consistent opponent of what he says is this slide towards militarization and war that he sees taking place in Europe. I discussed in a recent program how I felt that Orban's actions, his statements, his behavior at the recent NATO summit meeting in Copenhagen was his finest hour. How he pushed back constantly against the hysteria that was flying around at that time over the so-called Russian drone incursions and the Russian air incursions. I pointed out in many places how, well, fictitious that whole thing seemed to me to be. By the way, on that point, I understand that no proof has ever been found that any of the drones that were circulating over Copenhagen or Germany or wherever, or Poland, had any kind of Russian connection or origin at all. And in at least one case, it's been ascertained that in fact it was smugglers who might have been behind some of these drones. And on another case, it looks as if it was aviation enthusiasts. In other words, nothing to do with the Russians at all. I'm not absolutely clear about this because I don't pretend I've been following this story very closely. But anyway, Orban was talking out strongly at that time against all of this drift towards militarization in Europe. And Orban, perhaps alone amongst Western leaders, Fico in Slovakia sometimes weighs in on this, but much more Orban has been discussing the realities of the military situation in Ukraine and doing so with accuracy. It is he who has been saying, practically, as I said, by himself, that the reality is that it is the Russians who are winning the war, that the whole stalemate narrative is wrong, that the claim that Ukraine is winning the war is wrong, that the whole situation in Ukraine is deteriorating every day, and who has also argued and warned against the drift in Europe towards a wider war with the Russians. And I could imagine that Orban, who has perhaps a better understanding of what is going on in Moscow than any other Western leader, and perhaps tracks and follows what is going on in Moscow better than any other Western leader. He is, by the way, a workaholic who follows the news with incredible intensity. Anyway, it is possible that he has been picking up over the last couple of days and weeks how far the mood in Moscow has been hardening and the extent to which the Russians were coming very close to saying enough. And given that Orban remains someone who is very much in the interests of his own country, and yes, of course, of his own political position, wants to see some kind of return to peace, and I would say sanity, in Western Russian relations. I can imagine that he has been contacting Trump, with whom he has a long-standing and very friendly relationship, and urging Trump, and perhaps Putin as well, to have a discussion with each other and to talk to each other and to see whether the Alaska process can be put back on track. The reason why I think Orban has probably played a significant role in arranging this telephone conversation behind the scenes is firstly because Trump disclosed some months ago, that he and Orban regularly speak to each other and do so, moreover, far more often than is admitted, that has been confirmed by either government. They have regular conversations. And also, the other reason why I think Orban may have been involved is because Trump suggested that the summit meeting, the forthcoming summit meeting between Trump himself and Putin, should take place in Budapest. In other words, in Hungary, with Orban acting as the host. That strongly suggests to me that Orban has acted as the interlocutor, the person passing on messages between Putin and Trump, and that both Trump and Putin value this thing that Orban has been doing and want to continue to use Orban as an interlocutor when they meet again in Budapest. So this is what I think has happened. I think that Trump, again, has been, as he has on previous occasions, been drifting towards a policy of confrontation with the Russians, perhaps not fully understanding how dangerous in the long term it could turn out to be. Perhaps not fully comfortable with it himself, hankering still maybe for some kind of deeper long-term relationship with the Russians. And, well, maybe looking again for a way out. And then along comes Orban, telling him that the Russians would want to speak and were getting very alarmed, and explained and hearing from Orban how dangerous this idea of supplying the Tomahawks might be. And, well, out of all of those discussions, the telephone conversation that took place yesterday emerged. So we could see, as I said, the pattern. A very hard line from the Russians, including from Putin himself, last week. Putin suddenly softening as the prospect of a conversation with Trump suddenly began to crystallize. Uncertainty and disagreement within the Kremlin as Putin appeared to be shifting position. Orban probably playing a role of some kind behind the scene, and Trump himself playing his usual act of blowing hot and cold and not always being consistent, and stringing Zelensky along, and perhaps, as quite possibly might turn out to be the case, stringing Putin along also. And we will come to that shortly. But let's first of all discuss now what the two leaders have said about the conversation itself, because each government has provided its own account. And for once, they are relatively complementary. Let's turn first to Trump. Trump, as always, published his account of the conversation on Truth Social. And this is what he said. I've just concluded my telephone conversation with President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and it was a very productive one. President Putin congratulated me and the United States on the great accomplishment of peace in the Middle East. Great with a capital G, accomplishment with a capital A, peace, of course, also with a capital P. Something that, he said, has been dreamed of for centuries. I don't believe that. Putin said that, by the way. That is not at all, doesn't sound like Putin at all to me. I actually believe that the success, and the success is in capital S, in the Middle East will help our negotiation in attaining an end to the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin thanked the First Lady, Melania, for her involvement with children. He was very appreciative and said that this will continue, and that is true. We also spent a great deal of time talking about trade with capital T, and with trade between Russia and the United States when the war with Ukraine is over. At the conclusion of the call, we agreed that there will be a meeting of our high-level advisors next week. The United States' initial meetings will be led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, together with various other people to be designated. A meeting location is to be determined. So what Trump expects this time, and it's important, is that unlike what happened in Alaska, there is actually going to be a proper meeting, a pre-meeting between senior officials from each side to iron out and agree this time the agenda before the two leaders themselves meet. That is an important difference. As I discussed at the time and many times since, one of the problems with the meeting in Alaska was that it was not prepared properly. Trump suggests that at least this time, more attempts to prepare it better will take place. Anyway, Trump then goes on to say, President Putin and I will then meet in an agreed upon location, Budapest, Hungary, to see if we can bring this inglorious war between Russia and Ukraine to an end. President Zelensky and I will be meeting tomorrow in the Oval Office, where we will discuss my conversation with President Putin and much more. I believe great progress was made with today's telephone conversation. Now notice that Trump here takes it for granted that Putin has agreed to the meeting taking place in Budapest, as we will see from Ushakov's account of the conversation. That goes slightly beyond the truth, though since then the Russians have essentially confirmed that the meeting will be in Budapest in Hungary. And notice further something much more important, that Trump appears to accept in this Truth Social post that the meeting between himself and Putin in Budapest will be a bilateral meeting, that Zelensky himself is not invited. Trump will brief Zelensky about his call with Putin today, but Zelensky is not expected to go to Budapest. Back at the time of the Alaska summit, Zelensky tried to get himself invited. Indeed, at one point, he even tried to gatecrash the meeting. Other European leaders also did. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, also wanted to go to Alaska. The Russians, and eventually Trump, kept them all away. This time, Trump seems to be going out of his way in advance to tell Zelensky, you are not welcome in Budapest. Anyway, that's Trump's account of the call. As is so often the case, the Russian account is more detailed and more interesting and much more informative. So anyway, this is what Ushakov said to the Russian media. Colleagues, today in the afternoon, Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation, the 8th one, with US President Donald Trump. The conversation lasted almost 2.5 hours. Now, I think that is the longest conversation that Putin and Trump have had. It is longer, by the way, than the conversation they had when they met physically in Alaska. That conversation lasted, from memory, 1.5 hours. This conversation lasted for 2.5 hours. This was an enormous conversation. Clearly, it was a rather substantive and at the same time a very open and frank exchange. Now, I'm going to be very careful here. I've been taken to task before for perhaps over-interpreting Ushakov's words, but notice again that there is no suggestion here that this was a friendly or cheerful or warm conversation, or even what we're told. There's no, the word sincere, for example, does not appear. What we were told is that it was a rather substantive, very open and frank exchange. That doesn't mean that there was a row or anything like that, but someone, and we will see that it was clearly Putin, clearly had an awful lot that they wanted to say. Anyway, continuing with Ushakov's reader, our president started out by congratulating Donald Trump on his successful efforts to normalize the situation in the Gaza Strip. The US president's peace work has been duly appreciated in the Middle East, in the United States itself, and in most countries around the world. Now that is authentic Putin language, not something that people have been dreaming for centuries, but we see that Putin was indeed very fulsome in his praise of Trump, and why wouldn't he be? Putin supports the Gaza ceasefire. He also wants to avoid a conflict, a deeper conflict in the Middle East. That has always been Russia's policy, and we see that it has played out in exactly that way, according to this call. Anyway, Ushakov continues. Naturally, the Russian side outlined its principal position in favor of a comprehensive Middle East settlement on a generally recognized international legal basis that would ensure lasting peace for all the peoples in that region. And again, of course, what that is referencing is the need to abide by UN resolutions, all of which must ultimately lead up to the establishment of a Palestinian state. All of this, no doubt very friendly, but the Russians again stating their position. And then we get to the heart of the matter. A special emphasis during the conversation was placed on the Ukraine crisis. So this was the topic that took up the most time. Vladimir Putin provided a detailed assessment of the current situation, stressing Russia's interest in achieving a peaceful resolution through political and diplomatic means. It was noted during the special military operation, the Russian armed forces hold full strategic initiative along the entire line of contact. Under these circumstances, the Kiev regime resorts to terrorist methods, attacking civilian targets and energy infrastructure facilities, to which we are forced to respond accordingly. Now, what that looks like to me is Vladimir Putin trying to get Donald Trump to understand that what he's being told by Zelensky and by some of his own officials, Kellogg and Mike Waltz, for example, in a briefing that took place about 2 weeks ago, that Ukraine is winning the war, or alternatively, that the war is in some kind of deadlock, that all of that is not true, that Trump is being lied to, ultimately by the Ukrainians, but perhaps also by some people in his own entourage, and by the Europeans, and perhaps the British especially. That, in fact, it is Russia that is winning the war and which is advancing every day. Now, I'm going to say that there is an article in the Financial Times which clearly, in my opinion, has a British intelligence or British government source, which tries to push back on that specific point. It's an interesting article, and I will come back to it shortly. Anyway, this article tries to counter that by saying that it is the Russian generals who are lying to Putin, and that Putin, who is being given by the generals a distorted picture of the actual military situation, and who presumably over the course of this conversation that Putin had with Trump, who is passing on distorted information to Trump himself. So we can see that there is, if you like, a battle of narratives going on. Putin trying to explain to Trump, no, it is we who are winning. The Ukrainians telling you that they are winning are not telling you the truth, nor are the British, nor are Kellogg, who simply repeats to you whatever Zelensky tells him, nor is anyone else. This is the reality. We are winning this war. And this is the reality that you must work inside. So I suspect that this part of the conversation took up the most time. Knowing how Putin works, I suspect that Putin tried to take Trump through the details of what is going on across the contact line, tried to explain to Trump what the true situation in Pokrovsk, in Konstantinovka, in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, everywhere really is, so that Trump doesn't go away, doesn't continue to think that the reality is different. And notice that Putin also spoke about the terrorist nature of some of the things that Ukraine is doing, and the fact that the Russians are having to counter these things. Obviously, in part, this touches on the electricity war, the war over energy and electric stations. But of course, it also touches on other things. The blowing up of railway trains, the assassination of officials inside Russia, Zelensky's recent grant of further permission, or at least instructions to the Ukrainian intelligence agency, the SBU, to carry out further actions inside Russia. Putin again trying to get Trump to understand the nature of the regime in Kiev that the Americans are supporting, and the nature of the person, Vladimir Zelensky, who Trump is about to meet. Obviously, this is the Russian view, this is the Russian account, but it's the one that Putin, I think, probably spent the greater part of the discussion trying to get Trump to understand. And then Ushika continues as follows. Donald Trump repeatedly emphasized the imperative of establishing peace in Ukraine at the earliest opportunity, which is, of course, what Trump talks about all the time. He wants this war to end and end quickly. He wants to end this war tomorrow or today or even yesterday. He's not very patient with the detail. One can imagine that Trump perhaps didn't look entirely favorably upon Putin, probably going step by step through the various battles that are taking place. He just wants the war to end so that he can claim that he's achieved another great peace, perhaps win the Nobel Prize, and, well, do various more practical things like refocus the armed forces of the United States against the real enemy, which is China in the Far East, all of that. But anyway, and then Ushakov continues, the notion that the Ukrainian-Russian conflict has proven the most intractable issue in all peacekeeping efforts of the US president was palpably evident throughout his remarks during the conversation. In this context, he naturally mentioned his successes in settling 8 other regional conflicts. Well, maybe the Russian is slightly different, but I can't help but sensing a degree of irony on Ushakov's part at this point. This is Trump going on and on again about his great achievements as a peacemaker, his impatience to get it all ended, and all of that. And, well, maybe we can also see traces of irony and perhaps even humor in Ushakov's next statement. It is noteworthy that one of the US president's key arguments centered on the premise that the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine would open up tremendous, and he stressed this, tremendous prospects for the development of US-Russian economic cooperation. And of course, again, this has been a constant theme of Trump's, that Russia and the United States are natural economic partners. Russia's economy will boom. It will become immensely rich if it manages to achieve peace in Ukraine and achieve some kind of good economic relationship with the United States. And notice that Ushakov doesn't say what Putin's response was to all of this. It may be the theme that Trump was pushing, but Putin's interests lay elsewhere, in trying to get Trump to understand that it is the Russians who are winning the war, that what he is being told, that it is in stalemate, or that it is the Ukrainians who are winning, is simply wrong. And for Putin, it is security interests, questions of war and peace and victory that are paramount. And for the moment at least, he's parking to one side the economic and trade issues, which are the ones that Trump is so sold upon. Anyway, the next paragraph in Ushakov's comments touches on something that comes up in every conversation that Putin and Trump had. Incidentally, both sides spoke of the profound mutual affinity between the peoples of the two countries, which was so vividly demonstrated during the Second World War. It was underscored that the current state of bilateral relations appears paradoxical against this backdrop, which is, of course, true. I would say that Americans and Russians at the level of people do share a lot of things in common and do tend to get along well with each other. But then, of course, the political differences still have to be resolved before these mutual affinities can come into play. Anyway, then we have another key point, perhaps the single most important point that Putin felt absolutely, urgently needed to be made. The issue of potential supplies of long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine was also raised. Vladimir Putin reiterated his position that Tomahawks would not change the situation on the battlefield, but would inflict substantial damage to relations between our countries, to say nothing of the prospects of a peaceful settlement. So what Putin tells Trump is, look, these Tomahawk missiles that you want to send to Ukraine, why do you want to send them to Ukraine? Why do you want to deploy them in the theatre? They're not going to change the direction of the war. We are still going to win. But if you do this thing, forget about better relations. Forget about all of the trade and economic benefits that you're talking about. Forget about a negotiated solution to the conflict in Ukraine. If you send the Tomahawks, if you deploy the Tomahawks, you're attacking Russia. Americans will be launching missiles directly into Russia, and that's the end. We can't really, at that point, negotiate any further, and the prospect of good relations between our countries is going to be put back, perhaps for years, perhaps for longer even than that. And then we have the endpoints. In this context, it is worthy of note that the presidents discussed the possibility of holding another personal meeting. This is indeed a very significant development. It was agreed that representatives of both countries would immediately begin preparations for the summit, which could potentially be organized in Budapest, for instance. So Trump says it will happen in Budapest. Let's have a summit. The Russians, well, they didn't come to this call with the purpose of actually having a summit meeting. Trump clearly wants one. The Russians, well, Trump wants a summit meeting. We should have all of these meetings. We should have meetings with officials. Maybe we will move forward towards a summit meeting. And, well, Budapest was Trump's proposal. The Russians, as of the time of this call, had not agreed. Putin did not agree. But, of course, it's all crystallized since. The Russians now understand that there has to be a meeting, that this is what Trump wants, so that the meeting must indeed take place. And it must be carefully prepared this time, which is why there's all of the talk about representatives of both countries immediately beginning preparations. And, of course, the meeting has to be in Budapest. Not only does Trump want it that way, but at this present moment, it makes sense that the meeting be in Budapest. Now, I think there's this point, something needs to be said about that, because in Alaska, the Russians, Putin, said to Trump the next meeting should be in Russia, and the Russians have spoken about the next summit meeting after Alaska even being in Moscow. But we are in a crisis, a potential crisis in US-Russian relations. Holding a meeting in Moscow in that kind of way might not be satisfactory. Better hold the meeting in Budapest. And it makes a kind of sense, because holding the meeting in Budapest means again that Orban is there. The reason the momentum of the meeting in Alaska was lost, or so the Russians tell themselves and perhaps believe, is that instead of talking to people like Orban, Trump met with the European leaders in the Oval Office. He had meetings with Zelensky. He got sidetracked on discussions about security guarantees and trilateral summit meetings and deployment of European peacekeepers to Ukraine. And this time, what the Russians want is, after the meeting with Putin, the Russians want Trump not to be talking to people like Ursula and Mark Rutte and Macron and Merz and Starmer. They want him to talk, and Meloni. They want him to talk instead with Orban, the one person who has the most realistic understanding of the war, and who, unlike all of the other European leaders, genuinely wants to see a rapprochement between the Americans and the Russians, and generally wants to see a restoration of peace in Europe. And this, in my opinion, is why the Russians have agreed to hold the meeting in Budapest. This must be a difficult decision for the Russians. Notice that over the course of the conversation, Putin did not, in fact, agree to hold the meeting in Budapest. But in the hours that followed, the Russians have come round to the view that the meeting must be held in Budapest. For all of the reasons that I have just said, and despite the risks, and the risks are real, because Budapest is located on the territory of the European Union, and it is the capital of a country, Hungary, which is ringed by nations, by states that are hostile to Russia. So, how does Putin get to Budapest? He could try and fly across Poland. Poland is a very unfriendly country, and that might be risky. He could try and fly across Romania. But of course, trying to fly across Romania would also mean flying across Ukraine, and that must be out of the question. And the Romanians also are deeply unfriendly as well to the Russians under the current recently elected president. Budapest can be reached, but it's an incredibly complicated journey. If it's going to be a fully safe one, it means flying through Turkey, flying perhaps across the Black Sea, but more plausibly Turkey, flying maybe across Bulgarian or Greek airspace. Bulgaria and Greece, NATO and EU countries, both countries are saying that they will enforce the ICC arrest warrant against Putin. But both countries with very strong Russophile populations and heavily under the influence of the United States, perhaps less likely to take action against Russia, against the Russian president's plane, perhaps willing to accept an American military escort for that plane, and then, of course, pass through the airspace of these two countries into friendly Serbian airspace, and from there onward to Budapest, to Hungary. A complex, circuitous journey, but not without risks. Now, I have to say this, I think it is extremely unlikely indeed, unlikely to the point of statistical, I won't say completed significance, but statistical great unlikelihood that anybody from the EU, within the EU, will want to interfere with the Russian president's plane. Doing a thing like that would generally risk World War III, and I think even some of the more extreme leaders in Europe might balk at that. Certainly, I cannot imagine the government of Greece or the government of Bulgaria wanting to take those kind of risks upon itself. And the United States, anyway, has enormous authority over these countries and will no doubt insist that they do not interfere with the Russian president's flight. Interestingly, the deputy chief spokesman of the European Commission, Olaf Gill, has said that sanctions against Putin do not preclude his traveling to Hungary. Actually, it's been said by Anita Hipper, but apparently Olaf Gill has also weighed in on this. So two EU spokesmen. And Anita Hipper also said that EU countries can decide to suspend temporarily the execution of the order of the ICC, which prescribes to countries recognizing its authority the arrest of Putin. So these kind of things can happen, and one can see that that the Americans have been putting pressure on the Europeans over the last few hours. But nonetheless, I am sure that the FSO, the Russian security agency charged with providing Putin with protection, is going to be uneasy about this trip, that there will be intense discussions between the Americans and the Russians, and between the Russians and the Hungarians, and between the Americans and all of the other European states, to ensure that Putin's plane is not interfered with over the course of his trip back to and from Budapest. But from a Russian point of view, for all that and for all the assurances that are going to be given, there must still be question marks. And the fact that Putin is prepared to take these risks, that the Russians are prepared to take these risks, is indicative in itself of how precarious the whole situation between the United States and Russia has become, and of the imperative necessity, as at least Putin and those closest to him see it, to get the president, the American president, to understand the real situation. Now, I ought to say that Orban has already been talking to Putin. There's been telephone calls between Putin and Orban, and he apparently also intends to speak to Trump, and he's busy apparently arranging the summit meeting. Anyway, let's then conclude with the last part of Ushakov's readout. This is the simple part. On a separate note, it should be mentioned that our president highly praised personal efforts of the First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, in reuniting Russian and Ukrainian children with their families, and asked the US president to convey his very best wishes to his spouse. The Russians have come to realize, as many people have, that Melania is a person of influence on Trump, and that it's as well to keep on a good side of her. And no doubt Trump would have been pleased with that. And then Ushakov finishes with these words. Overall, I would say that the telephone contact between the presidents of Russia and the United States was quite useful, and the two leaders agreed to maintain contact. Thank you for your attention. Now, again, that's really it's not so fulsome. It's a little chilly. It says quite useful. I mean, that's the Kremlin's readout. Maybe in Russian it's a bit more positive than that. But, this isn't a sincere and warm conversation. It's not a conversation in which the two leaders made real progress with each other. Or it's just quite useful. Useful, presumably, because the Russians felt that at last they're able to explain things to Putin directly, and that, this is a good thing in itself. But that's all it is, apparently. So, in summary, Putin and Trump are likely to meet maybe in 2 weeks' time in Budapest. Orban is now busy working on the meeting, and Peskov has said that there's going to be work to set up the meeting. There's going to be apparently a telephone conversation initially between Lavrov and Rubio. The thing is that the issue will be worked out by Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Rubio. First, they will have a phone conversation and then meet and hold discussions on the topic, begin to discuss all issues. There are a lot of issues it is necessary to determine. Negotiating teams, everything will be in stages. And preparations for the meeting will be in several stages and must be carefully prepared. This time, the Russians do not want to be catapulted into a meeting in a rush, as happened during the meeting in Alaska, where nothing had been prepared properly in advance. Trump and Putin did not fully understand each other before the meeting. The meeting itself lasted only 90 minutes, and each man went away not fully understanding the position of the other. Now, this is where I'm going to turn to the latest article in the Financial Times, which has clearly been rushed out by someone in light of the fact that Putin and Trump are about to meet again. And, well, this account in the Financial Times, which it seems to me clearly originates mostly from sources within the British government, tries to represent the summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska as a near disaster. How Vladimir Putin's history rant in Alaska nudged Donald Trump closer to Ukraine. Donald Trump arrived in Alaska expecting to strike a deal with Vladimir Putin to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Instead, the president rejected his proposal outright and launched into a lengthy historical lecture. The two leaders and then spoke again on Thursday, but the fraught and Anchorage summit, which Trump nearly walked out of, had already reshaped the terms of their relationship. And we're told that Putin was greeted in Alaska with a handshake and a broad Trump grin, and momentum seemed on his side, but once behind closed doors, the warmth quickly faded, according to multiple people briefed on the talks. Notice that we are not talking about people who were actually present. There are people who were briefed about what happened in Alaska. And as I said, I happen to believe that those are mostly British officials. With just a handful of advisors present, Putin rejected the US offer of sanctions relief for a ceasefire, insisting the war would end only if Ukraine capitulated and ceded more territory in Donbass. The Russian president then delivered a rambling historical discussion spanning medieval princes such as Rurik of Novgorod and Yaroslav the Wise, along with the 17th century Cossack chieftain Bogdan Khmelnytsky, figures he often cites to support his claim Ukraine and Russia are one nation. Taken aback, Trump raised his voice several times and at one point threatened to walk out, the people said. He ultimately cut the meeting short and cancelled a planned lunch where broader delegations were due to discuss economic ties and cooperation. This, I am sure, is mostly fiction. It's possible, and it is likely, that Putin did bring up some of the historical matters. But I remember the meeting in Alaska very well. Everything about it suggested that it went off in a very friendly way. Trump agreed with Putin that there would not be a ceasefire, but instead progress to a full negotiated settlement. And I did not get the impression that Trump came away from the meeting angry and had been on the brink of walking out or anything like that. On the contrary, at the news conference, the two men seemed to be very friendly and happy to address the media with each other. And I remember that Putin, over the course of that news conference, said that he hoped that the Europeans would not try to derail the momentum of the process that had been started in Alaska. We can already see from this article in the Financial Times that the usual people are already busy at work trying to derail this entire process. I would add that the article goes on to say that it was after his disappointment with the meeting in Alaska that Trump basically started to speak about providing Ukraine with security guarantees and all of those things. That, in fact, is completely not the case. Trump already had before the Alaska meeting, conversations with the European leaders, telephone calls with the European leaders, very difficult and acrimonious calls, as, by the way, some of the subsequent calls with the European leaders also were. Over the course of one of these calls, Trump floated the idea that there might indeed be security guarantees for Ukraine and that Putin had agreed to them and that he'd also agreed to European peacekeepers being deployed in Ukraine. And I said at the time that this was clearly a misunderstanding and it wasn't true. So this article in the Financial Times is mostly fiction. It is an attempt by European governments already to create trouble, and we're going to see an awful lot more of that over the next few weeks. Is this process going to succeed? I am far from optimistic that it will. For the moment, at least, the idea of providing Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, I think, is in abeyance. However, trying to get Trump to understand what a make or break issue that could be, I think is going to prove for Putin extremely difficult. Trying to get Trump to understand that the Russians are winning the war is also going to be probably very difficult. After all, Putin can only speak to Trump occasionally. The Europeans, people like Kellogg, Zelensky, have access to Trump every day. It would require a president with the mastery of detail and the insight of President Kennedy, perhaps, to get a real handle of this on this situation. However, having said that, one must not give up. It may be that the combination of Putin and Orban this time will do the trick. That would be a case of hope triumphing over experience, but let's see. In the meantime, I am basically out of time, so there isn't really much time to talk about the military situation in Ukraine. There have been some very important developments. It looks as if the Russians are close to splitting the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk in half. It also looks as if there's now confirmation of the fall of the residential areas of Kupiansk. All of Kupiansk, in other words, west of the Oskol River, leaving the Ukrainians east of the Oskol River trapped. And really, almost incredibly, and I'm not sure that I believe these reports, but there are also reports that the Russians have crossed the Dnieper and have regained control of part of the city of Kherson, which would be a remarkable development if it were true. Lastly, there is now proof that the Russians are in Konstantinovka, inside Konstantinovka itself, as Gerasimov and the Russian General Staff have been saying. But this and more things I will discuss in my next program. This is where I'm going to finish the program today. Let me remind you once more, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.